Hi, I'm Ray Corriea, and this is the Game Maker's Notebook podcast. I had the great privilege today to speak with Remy and Pinki Lee, the creative director and narrative designer behind indie darling 1000xRESIST. This was a really fun one. Both of them have performance backgrounds, so we talked about how working in physical performance translated into game development. We talked about developing under constraints, how they built out their story, what real life events inspired it. And to me, this is just a really profound design conversation. So if you're really into deep narrative games, this one's for you. Please enjoy.
Tell me, Watcher, is there a feeling worth getting incinerated over?
Love your mother and trust in her teachings. Do your duties and carry out your function for a future far from sin or incineration. We're all just flowers in a garden of her making. Soon we'll grow beautiful enough to be worth taking. The All-Mother, she shines so bright, but Mother's glow is not as warm as it had seemed to be, and it feels very far from me, and it feels very far from me.
First question, I love asking this question. How did you get here? How did you get from where you were to being a game developer?
I guess I'll go first. I did a lot of fiction writing when I was younger, but then for whatever reason, I went to go study music composition at university, and I went to the same kind of like experimental art school. I got very lucky. I didn't know it was an experimental art school. It was just like the local school, but it was the same school that Pinki also went to. And studying music composition there, one of the things they really encouraged you to do was to go collaborate cross discipline with all the theater, dance, visual art, film people who were also studying at the same time. And so that's kind of how I got into working with theater, and then working with somebody like Pinki. And then in that context, I was kind of using live electronics, using my computer for music, and trying to keep up with dance and kind of devise theater processes, which were often improvisatory when they were making work. And I kind of struggled at first to keep up, but learned how to keep up. And then as we were making work this way, one of the things that started to happen also was we would go into tech week where we would mount the show for stage, and then a lighting designer would all of a sudden kind of appear and put lighting onto the work that we had made. And it really kind of shocked us. It's not that they did a bad job or anything like that, but it was one of those things where one of the values that we wanted to have was always to have all the elements of the work in the room while we were making it, so we could make decisions about it while we were kind of improvising. And so it was like integrated into the work. So that was when I picked up doing the lights as well, trying to incorporate LED lights and projection lighting so that we would be able to kind of see like a complete scenography when we were doing rehearsals or composing the work in a rehearsal room. And so that kind of led me into first Isadora, which is named after Isadora Duncan. It's like a kind of visual programming environment specifically for stage. It's like designed to be really fast so that you can keep up with the performers on stage, because they're often like getting cold while you're like programming or whatever. And then the next one was VVVV, which is this like outrageous like German kind of programming, visual programming thing. And then creative applications there was like a whole slew of stuff that was happening at that time. And then finally I started working with Touch Designer, which is kind of like a real-time branch of Houdini, and specifically designed for new media and for stage applications and for performance. And that was, I already had an interest in video games growing up. And so using those programs, I was trying to integrate some degree of algorithmic compositional process, or even kind of some degree of game mechanics on stage for the performers to do, and have the system react to it. And so that was my gateway kind of into eventually using something like Unity for real-time 3D rendering, and then kind of messing around in Unity. And when the pandemic kind of occurred, and I was sitting around with not very much to do, it was kind of the moment where I was like, okay, maybe this is the time. If there was any time to make a game, I guess now would be the time to try. So that's kind of how I got into this whole thing, I suppose.
Ooh.
Yeah. How did I get here? It's funny, actually, listening to Remy speak, I'm reminded of just maybe my relationship to technology, but maybe I'll speak to that later. So yeah, my background comes from contemporary dance and choreography. And I did meet Remy at a school that was really very interdisciplinary and very experimental and about device creation. And so in a lot of ways, when I think about where we started, it does make sense. It does make sense that we got here in some ways. Yeah. So working with Remy since like 2011, we were creating work at that time. And I think that I'm just, reflecting a bit on how my relationship. Oh yeah. Okay. So Remy said this thing about game mechanics in live performance, and I think it reminded me of the fact that there was something that we were often looking for in live performance that we would make together, and that was bodies responding, and that maybe both of us are a little less interested in perhaps like more conventional or traditional contemporary dance proper, where just moves are being done. But we actually always found it more interesting when humans were placed into situations where they had to problem solve, where they had to really be actively listening and actively responding. And so in some ways, I think that that's my relationship to integrating interactive technology into choreography. And I did that with Remy for so long that it continues to this day, that when I am making dance, I'm often looking to understand the technical conceits, like maybe build technological constraints first and foremost, as like a playground for dancers to work against, for that kind of dramatic tension, and for interesting movement and interesting activity to take place. And so that's something that I think about. But maybe I'll just say that very similarly, during the pandemic, found myself stuck in my house, was trying to figure out how to continue practicing and how to become better at my craft. And at that time, I had already started writing as an extension of my choreographic practice. Didn't really necessarily know very much about what I was doing, but I was curious about switching mediums a little bit from movement to text, was curious about how to translate my the way that I understand, like the way that I experience uh, rhythm, space, time, um, and just how
Yeah.
to explore the things that I do on stage, um, on paper, on screen. And so when Remy asked me to come on board for Sunset Visitor, it just it felt like a wild thing to do. And then after a couple of years, it got less wild. Yeah, but the learning curve continues to be very steep.
I love that. I've said this a million times already in talking to you too, but the theater to game developer pipeline, like there are a lot of us that find their way into this medium from that physical performance medium. And I find that really fascinating. I want to kind of ask you a little bit more about your transitioning from Pinki writing from movement, translating movement to text. What was that process like for you? Like, where did you start in your brain? Like, what does that process feel like?
Yeah, admittedly, I've had to, when I speak about this like learning curve, I do think there's something about uh, uh, text-based storytelling that requires a kind of specificity and sensitivity that's not necessarily very natural to the way that I
Mm.
think and feel and experience. And so, actually, there's this running joke that Remy brought me on because he, at first, when he brought me on, I asked, have you even read anything I've ever written? And he said, oh, I read your emails. And that was,
Thousands and thousands of emails worth of content.
Amazing.
I think he was speaking to the way that I articulate as a choreographer to our cast and to our ensemble. And
Yeah.
that. And admittedly, it's pretty, for those who have played the game, it's pretty Bang Bang Fire-esque.
Yes.
Yeah. So you can imagine sometimes like getting these emails from Pinki and and you have to like sift through to find the logistics. But that was a specific era. I don't know if that's the case anymore.
That was a specific era uh, in this economy. I don't know if we can be writing those emails like that.
Yeah, that was the
But
early Trudeau era. It's the sunny days.
but all to say, trying to, I think, yeah, and that is to, for me, my experience of time and being alive is quite rhizomatous, and I'm very, um, I'm not, I'm not literal, or rather, the way that I experience things is actually very abstract and very very metaphorical,
Okay.
rhizomatous, and so to translate into text, I think what it meant is that this storytelling or the ways that I would meet text was very constellation, very very imagistic.
Mm.
But in terms of like crafting linear experience and building relationship with characters, I think that's something that really was very, very far from what I did. And so I think that was part of the profound learning curve, like trying to figure out, trying to harness the things I do best, which is kind of like um, uh, poetics,
Mm.
and metaphor, and then harness that into, like, say, dialogue between two characters. And yeah, Remy will attest to this. I wasn't good at it to begin with.
No comment.
we all learn. This is starting to having played 1000xRESIST and listening to you talk about your process. A lot of things are starting to make sense for me now because the way that characters speak is very poetic. There's a lot of movement in the ebb and flow of character conversation. So I definitely feel that coming across. Like there's a lot of forward momentum when characters speak. So I can hear you in the way that characters speak. So that's really cool to hear about your process. Um, I wanted to talk to, and both of you have touched on this a little bit already. In a previous interview, Remy, you talked about how this game was made, consciously made with limitations in mind. And you've both sort of touched on, we were in a stagecraft and wanting to do more, and sort of the learning curve in, we're in a pandemic, we can't perform on stage. So what can we do to keep performing? So I would love for you to just elaborate on that.
Yeah, I think this is something that especially as like a freelance artist, kind of coming out of school, that you eventually have to kind of learn, especially in the performing arts, because you have no resources. But beyond that, maybe say just specifically from a scenario of like where you situate your own work in amongst your peers and in kind of history, I guess. Is that early on for me, kind of, even though I studied music composition, and then I was kind of going around doing music festivals and doing the classic composer, quote unquote, I'll just say quote unquote, like new classical composer, like as a term for simplicity purposes, that you would go notate music, and you would go submit these to competitions, or you would try to submit them for performing festivals. And I remember it was very specifically one trip to Germany where I met some German peers, and they, I don't know if people know, but like in Germany, they live and breathe this type of music. Like they're playing and singing in choirs and like in church, and like and they're like playing violin since a young age, and they have like orchestras, community orchestras, community school orchestras, and all this stuff. So basically, I get there, and I have these peers who are like sight singing to musicians, and really communicating to the musicians things that they had composed from a very musician to musician level, right? And I was born in kind of like Canadian suburbs, and there was no such orchestra for me to play in, and like basically very early on, just kind of acknowledging that based on my background and their background, like if I tried to play the same game as them, where I would try to be out musician as a composer their work, I would lose pretty quickly. So like I think that was a kind of an admission to there. I guess there's two paths. One is that you would like take out the books and study hard, and the other would be like, okay, well, like can I, for lack of a better word, flank this to a certain degree, and actually look within my own background and be like, okay, what things am I interested in as much as they love, I don't know, love Bach, for example, right? And so that was a real kind of moment early in my kind of artistic career where I was like, okay, I think what I have to look at is my own limitations and play to those in a kind of interesting way, which is much of how I ended up doing kind of that new media stuff and thinking about games and performance as well. But that just leads me to say that, always in every single work was something I was starting to bring in, was like, okay, what are the limitations that we can put onto this work that can expose an opportunity that we wouldn't have thought of if we didn't have this limitation. And as Pinki was saying, that was just something that we started doing in general, whether, onto bodies, say, and onto humans in rehearsal. That sounds like a weird thing to say, but like, and then, but that was also from a formal place as well. Like, okay, what are some formal conceits and rules that we can place amongst ourselves so that we can actually kind of work inside of a constraint, and then if that constraint is interesting, it will expose an opportunity that we didn't think about, or other people didn't think about, because they did not put these constraints on themselves. And so, going into making this game, the constraints were also very real. Because there's like a pretty small team that made this, and indie games are still indie games, the kind of interval or gap between a small indie team and like even a double A team of like say 15, 20 people is like quite huge, right? And so we had to think very early on about, okay, what is feasible for us to achieve, and one of the many constraints, I think I've said this in other places, is that, okay, like, let's make the story about clones. Let's only kind of focus on one model. Let's make them wear
Mm.
masks, because then we don't have to make their mouths move. But then, of course,
Yeah.
one of the watchers' mask is transparent. So, yeah, it's okay. And then we actually did have, like, for the record, we did have their mouths moving in build for a long period of time, but then we axed it at the last moment because we thought that, like, we couldn't get it performing well amongst all the characters. And so we were like, okay, we have to ship this thing, so let's turn it off. But yeah, like, other constraints were such that when we didn't have the means, and we did this all the time in theater as well, or on stage works, if we didn't have the means to literally depict an event, we would seek out either metaphor or seek out some degree of abstraction on stage in which to depict that event. And that's what we did a lot in the game, because we were like much like, for example, when Iris decides to, I don't know, kill all the 50. There is a version of that where you could have a cutscene where they're all like doing things, and there's like small business, like the models are like, I don't know, hanging onto the walls or whatever, and um, and then you can see it happen in real time. But instead, because we could not do that, we kind of, the way that it's depicted in the game is that we stumble across them kind of in Tableau, and then they all get eviscerated. So, like, things like this where we were looking for abstraction with different types of techniques to help us kind of depict things that were outside of the scope of what we could usually do. So
almost like constraint as aesthetic, and
Yeah.
constraint as aesthetic.
as house style.
Yeah, that is house style. Yes,
I think that is house style.
Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like, well, I appreciate that your game doesn't do any hand holding. I would actually go so far as to say that you've executed what I feel is a masterclass in subtext. I think that there's like you do a lot of that, and it's definitely not lost on the player, and it definitely adds to the suspense. And I want to talk about the coupling of designing with constraints in mind, constraint as aesthetic, and then deciding what information that you want to surface to the player when to give them the space to kind of infer and think about something themselves versus handing it to them directly. You don't handhold them at all. There's absolutely no handholding in your story. So I would love to know how you approach it from the other angle. Like, what do you decide needs to be said versus what needs to be shown, I guess?
You should do this one, Pinki.
That's a great question. I don't know if I immediately have an answer. Yeah. Hindsight is 2020 for sure. Maybe the first thing I want to say is probably intuition. I think that both Remy and I are not crazy about exposition. I think we often talk about by nature of being first gen kids, kids of immigrants, there's a kind of straddling of culture and language, and an in-betweenness that translates into a literacy in a space of subtext in a place where I think culturally we many a thing is not said.
Mm-hmm.
And that is so big in terms of expression and relationship and being alive. And so, something that I wanted to even mentioned related to what we were speaking about earlier is that I think the reason why we find constraints so compelling in storytelling is that it actually, I think it is real life. Like it's very, um,
Yeah.
we just live in constraints. We live in containers, in within rules and regulations that we're up against all of the time. Uh, yeah, we're not traipsing around the world all free and liberal and able to say and do anything and everything we want. Maybe some of us more than others, but I think that that's why both technical and conceptual and like both
Mhm.
formal and um, narrative, uh, everything in terms of telling stories that ring true to the human experience. I think that we just find that constraints really uh, it feels like real life.
Yeah.
Whether or not we've abstracted it, or whether or not we've taken a more technical element to the notion of constraints. But in terms of what to tell, um, yeah, I think my answer is maybe intuition. It is very true that I think we wrote into relationships, uh, just looking to understand the emotional beats first and foremost, and then to me, I think it was like, almost like a afterwards in the revising, in the coming back to, in the um, editing of that language, and then in the playtesting, figuring out like what did people need in order to really lean into a character or really like fall in love with them. Uh, yeah, yeah, but admittedly, many of those, I feel like everyone in the game is holding all sorts of cards close to their chest. So it's like, no, how often were people saying what they mean? Not very often. uh, yeah, I don't know. Remy, thoughts?
I mean, I think that's one of the things that we always leaned into. It's like, oh yeah, what's the like grace and beauty of like people not saying what they mean, but you like understanding what they're saying. And I think part of it is like a lot of this culture, at least for us, it's like when people want to help others save face, you know, like there's a whole graceful dance around this. And and sometimes, you know, you're like, wow, that was really graceful. That was like a really graceful. So, and it's like really kind of a completely subtextual event that is occurring.
Yeah.
And so like in much of our writing with these characters, or I guess our general sensibility, it's always about for these characters, or at least it seems to me that we like it when they are, yeah, playing this graceful dance with each other. And sometimes some better than others, right? And with with like Noah being the best at this,
Mhm.
and um, so yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of that is like what Pinky said, kind of a lived experience thing. Um, and in general, in terms of one thing we should also say is that when you go to voice record, we wanted to have space for the actors to insert something, right?
Mhm.
And so like if for example you write a line that's like very prescriptive about how it needs to be performed based on the content in that line, you're often going to have actors like something we say in performing arts is they're going to be in unison with the text, or their kind of delivery is unison with the text, and then what you get is like this kind of like massive like monophonic thing. Whereas if you kind of allow them to, if like they're saying something that where much of the affect or the subtext of the line is needs to be kind of interpreted by them, you often get a performance that is much more there. You can feel that they're like thinking, so to speak, and that they're actually working. They're like, as an actor, they're like working. So they're not just saying the line with X emotion, right? They're like, okay, like how do I, use my own lived experience to interpret this line and do this. And
Mhm.
so they bring a little bit more of themselves. So that was another reason why I think, so many of these lines are not so straightforward, I guess. Yeah.
I want to dive into the story now that we're kind of like digging into your individual characters. Um, the inspiration on the surface feels like I can see the pandemic's influence on your story. You describe your studio on your website. You describe yourselves as Asian Canadian diaspora creators. I can definitely see that in the writing as well. But you also have these very universal themes: generational trauma, need for empathy. I catch the whiff of Evangelion in there as well. So I have to ask, where did the germ of this story come from? Like, how did we get from your start to the very intricate tapestry that is your final game?
This is going to be really insane. I think much of it was like devised. Like, I don't, if that makes sense. Like, when I was like working on the prototype, I was doing it by myself, early on
Wow.
in the height of the pandemic in like April 2020. This is before,
Oh gosh.
um,
Yeah.
yeah, like this was like 1 month into it. Um, and it was really like, again, classically like, okay, what pieces do we have, um, in front of me? At that time, I had to consider that I was making this game by myself. Like, it was before there was a thought that, um, maybe a team would come on, because I had not considered yet that, okay, maybe
Being a
we
game
would be
dev.
able, yeah, being a game dev. So I was just like, okay, I'm just going to mess with this around with stuff that I have. And, I mean, and I think this is also how Pinki works when we're or we in general work when we're like making something new. Like, there's like just a general amount of things swimming around in our brain. Like, how do we want to, um, kind of coalesce that, and then you just start throwing things at the wall, right? And early on, one of the things that was thrown at the wall was, okay, the school, because like, I don't know, there was just a thought of, um, what was happening in schools right now, and the kind of play of like, whether you're in person, you're not in person. And then, the clone kind of model thing kind of came in quite early, because I was like, I can't, it'd be great to just use one model, because like, I'm here by myself. I was using kind of assets that I could just get, or I think I commissioned, um, a very simple version of the clones, from a model maker. It was not Kodai at the time, um, and and then just started kind of playing around, and really much of that was just kind of, and this is something that we try to do all the time, which is that we're just trying to be very porous to the world around us, and what is happening. Um, and that's why I think this game, so much of this leans into 2019, 2020, where like, at the time I was still thinking about the Hong Kong protests. I mean, I still think about it, obviously, but like, it was very present. Um, and there was, the we had just been there actually in October 2019, so not very long, before, the pandemic. And so, and I still had like a gig there while I was doing it remotely during the pandemic. And so it's like all of that stuff was kind of coalescing around this scenario, um, where there were clones, where there was, some kind of, simulation, communion thing, um, and I, that's kind of how it started to begin. And then when we brought the team, it was like we were starting to keep throwing things. I think in general, like, this is somewhat unsatisfying an answer, because it's like, we really build one brick at a time, if that makes sense. Where there's just laying track in front of us, only as much as we need, and then we keep laying it and laying it and laying it and laying it, uh, and then at the end of it, now, it's kind of like there's a thing at the end. So, um, I feel, yeah,
How
that's,
unsatisfying.
Wow.
I know. I'm sorry.
No,
I'm sorry. Yeah, yeah.
No, that's interesting. The idea of because I think, again, as writers, creators, we sometimes find ourselves maybe being over prescriptive with ourselves. And again, going
Mm,
back to what you've said about consciously making this with limitations and thinking about limitations, laying the track, only the track you need at the time to move forward, I think has resulted in a really, interesting, profound story. That was just how your story was built.
I think I can add on to this is that like maybe it comes, and a bit of this is in the game as well, but like maybe it's because of my music background, my music composition background, where much of my early work was writing notes on dots on paper, right? And so in that scenario, you're often having to be quite prescriptive, or like, okay, the relationship you have with the work often is that you as the composer are going to like reach into the air and plop onto this piece of paper like a fully formed thing that and that's that's kind of the relationship to the work you have, right? And then you go take that work and you go give it to musicians, and like maybe that's 6 months later, and they'll read it and play it back to you, and it was a really unsatisfying kind of like old school process, I think, like that's for me anyways. And already, even with kind of like electronic music or electroacoustic music, you have instant playback, and so your relationship to the work is one that is much, the kind of a distance or proximity to the work is much closer. And so I think in general, like I've come to really dislike kind of this overarching plan or documentation in this way. and because like, this was something, that's what you're expected to show up with as a composer. You're like, here it is, it's all done. Like, take a look at my script, take a look at my notation. Whereas I much prefer, again, probably from our experience in the devised theater, something that's a little bit more chaotic and something that can surprise you, right? Because if you're writing notes on a piece of paper, you're never going to, like, sure, you can like pretend that you've surprised yourself with your own genius, right? But like, but there's like likely, you're never going to surprise yourself, right? Because how could you? And whereas, when you're working with either in devised theater, you're constantly trying to surprise yourself, right? You're constantly being surprised by what is happening. And in this case, for the storytelling, I think, a lot of the energy of the game and the energy of the narrative is really for us, just really coming from us trying to surprise ourselves. And much to kind of talk about the question that you had earlier about like, how do you determine when do people know what happens and all that stuff. It's mostly just like, we're just trying to excite ourselves, right? And we're like, okay, well, sometimes we may put something inside of here, or in a chapter where we're like, oh, that really will have like long lasting effects later down the line. But it's exciting. And so we'll do it now and then deal with the consequences later. So there's a little bit of live in the moment.
The consequences. So ominous.
Like the narrative consequences of that later. We'll have to figure it out, I guess.
Yeah.
I don't know, Pinki. Yeah.
Maybe I'll just jump on there, and because as I'm hearing you speak, I feel like if the idea that we're always chasing the next most exciting thing, I think that there's a way that could be a bit of a misnomer. Like I don't necessarily think we were looking to entertain ourselves, like pick the most radical choice at every turn. Like actually that isn't what was happening in the writer's room. And so, or maybe I just want to re-articulate that, like leaning into what felt like the right next and most exciting choice sometimes meant like the more boring choice, like the more the more painful or the more difficult to write. Like I think perhaps I'm just thinking about differences in terms of where we chose what should happen next versus how it should happen next, because I think that maybe just listening to Remy speak, I feel like it sounds as if we just came up with it on the spot at every point and turn, but I actually think that there's a bit more of that old school composition than than you give yourself credit for, Remy.
I
And
see.
in that way, I mean,
I can't outlive it.
like,
Yeah, I can't outrun it.
I think there's a couple things. Remy consumes media voraciously. It's like, um, yeah, playing games, watching movies, watching shows, like voraciously. And so I think just even the phrasing, and how to create compelling composition, and seeing that as a whole, I think that is like runs in all sorts of like I think that there's a lot going on on the back end in Remy's CPU. I think that I had the luxury of coming on and kind of, I would be given the little constraints and I would write into those constraints. But even as a narrative designer, I have a lot of trouble seeing the whole big picture and understanding like the energetic arc. But I do think that that's something that Remy always had his pulse on, which was, oh, we need to slow down right now. This is like the 11 o'clock number, and nothing too satisfying should happen here. Or like, this is around the time where we should crack everything open and it should get weird. And there should be no resolve, and everyone should be kind of like left like a little off center. And so those embodied, how would I call it? Instincts. I think it is being drawn from, of course, like years and years and years of experience, in a way that supports the devising.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, like the music, my music degree does feel less painful now.
Oh no,
I have no regrets.
Yeah,
I have no regret. I know, but I do think that, like, you know, studying music, because kind of writing, I don't know if we're going off topic here, but like when kind of writing fiction earlier as a kid, I felt very unmoored, because I was a kid, and then also because
mood.
Also because I didn't know. Yeah, like, you know, you there's a lot of, especially with fiction or like speculative fiction, there's like a lot of stuff happening, as Pinki said, like in the back end, that makes it work. That's like not immediately kind of easy to chart on just like the literal surface of a work of fiction. And so I think studying music was accidentally the right choice, because all of music is like, really, you're dealing with often very abstract materials along a time domain, and you're just asked to kind of like organize this, and like, how do you organize this in interesting ways, and how can you know, organize the simplest thing into the most interesting kind of configuration. And I think there's like a whole history of that, and kind of knowledge from multiple cultures about how one does that, and it's kind of interesting how that, I think that was necessary for me to kind of understand how to write fiction again, I suppose. Yeah.
Right. And I think really helped us organize this intricate tapestry that is 1000 times resist.
Were you also, this is such a random question, but were you also that kid that nobody wanted to play with on the playground because the games you made up were too complicated, because you were an unmoored kid with a lot going on inside, and then you turned to writing?
You know, I did try to like, I mean, I kept trying to like dig into the deep memory here. There are definitely like complex games that I tried to run, or like that wasn't really picked up, and we just played tag, I guess. I was like, oh yeah, let's play tag, but like maybe like, I don't know, some constraint. I don't want to make up one right now because not in situ, but yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like something that a lot of us creators have in common is looking back at stuff we did as a kid and then being like, oh, I saw it then. Like, why didn't I realize like I was going to end up here? But I can empathize with that, being the unmoored child writing in their room. And now here we are. We all make games.
Well, I used to write in class, and and my teachers got really upset at me because I wasn't paying attention to them. And I was just like, and there was actually many discussions about this with my parents where they were like, why is he like he needs to pay attention because, you know, school is really important, right? Like whatever we're teaching you in grade 4, grade 5, you're going to remember for the rest of your life. And like,
Send them this
that's
interview.
again, if you don't, if you don't remember what you learned in grade 4, grade 5, like, oh my God, what's going to happen? Yeah. So I don't know. That was, yeah, I don't have to go too far into my kid life.
I don't remember what I learned in grade 4, so it's okay. And you turned out great. So
We'll see.
everything is fine. I want to talk about the narrative design in your level design and your art direction as well. When I was playing, I very much felt like I was in a sort of liminal transit space. And going back and reading interviews that you've done, I saw you use the term transit core, which was really, 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 really interesting to me. So I want to talk about that a little bit. And I also want to talk about how you decide what your level design is going to be. So for each communion and each chapter, we change. Sometimes we're in third person and we're running in this big space. Sometimes we're in, you know, like when you're on the train, you're in a very constrained space. And sometimes you're first person. And of course, when we think of games and we think of gameplay, I feel like everyone tends to think of like, okay, what's the combat? Like, what are you hitting? What are you doing? But you don't really hit anyone in this game. It's a very different kind of gameplay. So how did you decide which segments were going to be first person and which were going to be something different?
I think it was like some of them were homages. So like, you know, it made a lot of sense to, and this is where like, you know, the fact that games have a history that, you know, we've been, you know, been around long enough that we can like be like, oh yeah, most people played this and that we can reference it, which is great. And so chapter 2, I think was, chapter 2 was obviously, I think, for us, let's do first person because like we, you know, the thing that we're immediately referencing is Gone Home, you know, but what if it was Gone Home, but you know, Asian Canadian and the apartment is small, right? So like, not the vast mansion that they live in, and I don't know where they live in Gone Home. I think it was Oregon or something, some sort of Pacific Northwest place where there was a lot of space, and so that was kind of the immediate thrust after a kind of fixed camera scenario in chapter 1. So. And then chapter 3, I think we had just talked about it being a little bit of like a fairy tale, like a dark fairy tale. And so we were thinking of it storybook like, and then that was like, oh yeah, let's do side scrolling. Yeah. And then chapter 4, I think at that point chapter 4 was weird. Like I'm trying to think about how did it come through. I think there was like very minor plans for it, like that we kind of threw out, and then for some reason it was like, oh, let's do a cave. I'm trying to think back to it now. Like I think like part of it was supposed to be really like a cult, I suppose. There was a kind of like a culty feeling because it was nowhere. And I don't know why. It was again these connections, you know, like you just run on these like impulses, and you're they don't always make sense, you know.
Yeah.
And then like, well, the cave. I think I remember you remember Pinki, like the early prototype version of the cave. I think the early prototype version of the cave. The only thing, like the thing that really jumped out to us. I think there were two things that we remember from that was the door.
Mm-hmm.
And the diagonal jow is what we call it. Yeah, so I think that was like, you know, again, this was like heavily kind of iterative, right? Like we kind of threw this in here and then continued to iterate around what we saw. And
Mm-hmm.
you know,
Yeah, but I think sometimes we already knew what perspective and how gameplay, and sometimes we didn't. And I'm thinking about that chapter 3, this fairy tale side scrolling. Like it was a little bit hard won in that. I think sometimes in these interviews we talk about just looking for the ideal pairing of like, what is a story that we're looking to tell, and what mechanics is going to support the experience, like the player's experience of that story. And I think the nice thing about watcher communioning in order to experience these memories, like we could use that third person, first person, just like that proximity to engage the whole experience of living somebody else's life or going through somebody's memories. Could actually spatialize that kind of stuff. But yeah, I'm just thinking about chapter 3. I feel like we came up with the side scrolling because I was having so much trouble writing that damn story.
Yeah, that was rough. That
I was
was a
just
rough
so
one.
blocked, and we had done this big writers. We had decided that we had decided what my task was, and I couldn't do it, and so we just kept coming back. And I was like, I can't write. We had plotted out some beats, and I just couldn't do it, and so we kept looking for what's a genre or tone, what's a different angle, so that we can actually find something cool in this, and you can write.
Yeah, I think then I do remember chapter 3 being a lot of back and forth of already in engine. We were just like moving. That was a weird one because it was like while you were kind of having that experience, I guess.
Oh gosh.
Well, we were like just building it in engine already, or I remember building it like just like these dioramas of
Right.
of things, right?
And that was the thing. Coming back to constraints, we knew that it was still going to be in the bunker. Everything's in the bunker. So
yeah, I mean, there was like it was, and then also I think we had asked Kodai to, can you make the bunker but proscenium, and he did it, and like you look at those sets, it's so funny. I think you could like 3D print out those chapter 3 sets, and like maybe you could actually build it in real life, like that's yeah. And then speaking more about like formal high level things, like I think the second half of the game is actually a repetition of the form in the first half. So like chapter 1 and chapter 6, chapter 2 and chapter 7, chapter 3 and chapter 8, and so like chapter 8 and chapter 3 are all side scrolling. Chapter 2 and chapter 7 is first person, and then chapter 4 and chapter 9 are third person.
Running amok.
So like that was that at that point, I think, we were using certain rules for ourselves to help us as well.
There is the one difference in chapter 7. I want to talk about your real life footage that you dropped in there. I audibly gasped when that popped up. I was so surprised. And it was such this like long, beautiful moment. And I feel like you were going for that kind of like, oh my God factor. What made you decide to just like, where did that video come from? Where did that idea come from to just like plunk that in there at that moment? Like, what was like, why? It hurts. Why? Why?
Okay, I'm gonna try and not like. Okay, there's like a couple of. I mean, if anything, I think this is like an interesting kind of outcome of like of this things carry certain energies. Certain energies are imbued in things, and it's and a lot of that is from the context in which they were made and the time in which they were made, and they kind of carry that energy. So that footage is actually from a film that we shot in Hong Kong, where there was a couple of us that had gone to Hong Kong to shoot it, and we spent like a month and a half there or something, and we just spent every day shooting to the point of like almost exhaustion, where we would like get up and like, all right, let's take the camera and like let's go and eat lunch and then like go and just run the camera at rent, because like Hong Kong is such a textured city, like you can go anywhere and film anything and be like, all right, let me try and make something out of it. And so we actually have from that project I think, I don't know, hundreds of hours of footage.
Wow.
Specifically, it was shot in 2017, which at the time, there was lots of stuff happening, right? So like an in between time, and because of I was like working on that film, editing it, up until the pandemic. Literally, that was the thing I was doing as like we were getting emails
Wow.
from like tours getting canceled and things like this, and like and so we showed it like once, and 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 then the pandemic happened, and so then we were like, okay, all the places that we had planned to show it subsequently had closed down, or like they were not happening, and so we so then some of the people in the film who had since been in certain positions had to leave Hong Kong after a while. So then we had to bury the film I was like, okay, let's bury the film because they're in the process of leaving Hong Kong, because and that could be somewhat maybe not the best time to show that film or try to push that film around.
You
And
mean
so for their safety, yes. And so still to this day, we actually haven't shown that film again. And to a little bit of charging from my peers who worked on it, but like it was weird because like when we were working on chapter 7, it was actually a very quick thing that was done. At the very end, we had kind of been like, okay, well, they're going to experience the very first communion, and how do we depict this very first communion in a way that's actually impactful? And it's also like Iris kind of opening up to the ancient sisters in a way that we had not seen before. And I was too tired to make it in Unity. I was like, all right, I can't.
That's a good reason. That's a really good reason.
I really can't. And then I was like, looked over like this, like my orange hard drive, like my, the one like with the like soft padding with all the Hong Kong footage on it. And I was like, all right, fuck it. Like I'm going to go grab some of that stuff and started just editing it together. And like, I have to say much of the footage, a lot of like the look of it and a lot of the way that it moves, much of that is due to Sepper and I can't remember how he used his pseudonym. Another person. Yeah. I'll just say another person. Sepper and another person. They're also collaborators that we went to school with, and they worked in film, and we've worked with them for a really long time. Like they've documented a lot of our performing arts work, and Sepper in particular has a very specific way of moving with the camera. And he also studied dance for a while, I think, and got into all that stuff, and is for some reason really flexible as well. Like he's double jointed everywhere. So like he's kind of like moving the camera in weird places that you wouldn't otherwise. It's kind of grotesque sometimes when you watch him. and a lot of that movement is in that footage, like just the way that the camera moves. And so like their energy is definitely in that, and it was a very particular time. And so when I was editing it together, I was like, oh, this is like I didn't think it would hit as hard as it has, seemingly. But that's the way, I guess, like you're just kind of trying to keep your head above water sometimes, and
yeah, out of desperation, I think sometimes we make great choices.
I fully agree.
And I think that's why we always push ourselves into these desperate moments from like a narrative perspective, or from like when we were talking about making difficult decisions in the narrative, we're trying to put ourselves in a place where we truly become desperate, for better or for worse, right? And then from that desperation, we make choices that have a specific energy behind them, and it becomes kind of not automatic, but like it's just a normal action that you're making in that context, but like it carries a specific thing, I guess, because of that.
Yeah, absolutely. This dovetails nicely into a question I wanted to ask you about writing your ending. So obviously the game has quite a few endings depending on what kind of choices you make for the world ahead. But again, in previous interviews, you've talked about how you struggled to figure out how you wanted to end it and how the writing work became crushing at one point. I think you used the word crushing. So I would just love to talk about, that moment when you, like, how did you determine your finale, basically? Like what was your goal? How did you decide that this is where you want to end it? Because I think, again, as creators, and I've talked with a couple of writers on this podcast where we talk about, the ending being the hardest part. It's like you could iterate on this forever if you're making a live services game, but when you're making, a narrative experience, like, you have to kind of end it. So for you, how did you make that decision?
It was really crushing, at least for me. I think it was kind of like, as you say, like, I had the feeling, because so much of the game is like kind of relishing and enjoying telling itself. I mean, that's how I feel anyways. Like, I think we like telling, and the ways to tell, that like this put us in a different mode, because we had to end it. And I was also haunted by the fact that, like, there's an extra risk that narrative games take on when you do it, to do narrative games. Like, if you don't end it in a way that people feel is good, it's really bad, and could sink the ship. And so I think there were some decisions made during the ending that like were somewhat like more on the back foot than we usually were. But at the same time, we tried to also, push as hard as we could. And for example, that's also why BBF gets shot, right? Like, we were like, should BBF get shot? But like, the honest thing that would happen is like BBF gets shot here. Like, yeah, I don't know. I think, Pinki, like, what's some of your thoughts? Like, we did go that one day. We walked out to UBC. We didn't walk out. We drove. Because we were having a real kind of thematic crisis. Or at least I was. Maybe I was.
Maybe you were.
Ooh. Ooh.
Yeah, I guess I can speak from the other end of it, which is perhaps the easier stuff, which is the minutia, the like word by word stuff. And so there are some things we knew about the ending, and there are many things we didn't. What we did know, like, I guess, Remy, I just want to talk about the impossible conversations, because there's, by then we were really well attuned to the thematics of the game. And so, even early on, before, like, for example, before anyone was working on the ending, I was already generating text material, dialogue for the ending. And so, so choice, we knew that we wanted choice to be important. We also knew that, or rather, one of my tasks was really basically to nuance every character so that there was no clear villain. And to really kind of upend, basically keep the nuance alive, as a thematic. Like, at the end of the road, nothing gets less complicated. And this question of what do we take with us and what do we leave behind, that we leave that negotiation in the hands of the player. And so what do we have to set up in order to hand that over to them in a way that's very satisfying. I'm like, I didn't think two thoughts about BBF getting shot. I just was writing about, like, well, after all of this that we've experienced, how might one feel? What are the legacies left in the bodies of these characters, actually, 12 chapters later. And then, Remy just got to pick I just wrote, I wrote 25 scenes and he picked that one. I don't know. Like, or I think there was, oh yeah, at one point, I think Remy, you were like, oh, we can't do all 25. So the ending, it's getting too long. Like it's getting too heady. It's getting too wordy. Like by the time chapter 11 came around and got
big,
so pregnant and so massive, then it really changed what we thought about what should happen after. So again, it's like the poetics of the affect and the temporal quality. Like how long have we spent here? So how should we move in space now, and where should we go? So yeah, a lot of feeling into that ending. But I feel like I had the funner job, which was just to make to just write. And then there was one day where we had to decide which of those impossible conversations made it to the end, and we decided it would be like 5 of them rather than all 25. and then back into that hard crushing work of where to align the things so that we get to those ending moments and they carry everything that we wanted them to carry.
Yeah, I mean, the one of the kind of values that we wanted to have at the very, very end, and I know some people have said, though, I wish there was more closure to a certain extent, but I think we really wanted it to end a little bit like how it began in terms of like those epilogues, kind of like giving you an openness and mystery again of like, whoa, what happened in the interim?
You mean epitaphs, yeah?
Yeah, the epitaphs. And part of that was just like, okay, well, we want this game to be honest to itself, and like this game this whole time is relished in kind of unfolding mystery, and so like let's end on a new mysteries as opposed to like it's all done and everybody's happy or whatever. Which was never going to be the case anyways, but like say like
not
that this was yeah. So for sure we definitely wanted to end on a kind of like having many questions open, and so that it would resonate after you play it, and kind of like that loop is not closed, and so there's a degree of kind of thinking about it, which is just something that I've observed in my own thing. If a loop is closed in a thing that I've experienced, I'm like, oh, I don't know. And also very kind of somewhat maybe a risky aspect of it is that like I do think some of those gestures sometimes can be that like immediately when you're playing it, you're like, oh, you have a certain affect, but then maybe down like 5 days later, you're like, oh, like, which is kind of what you're looking for. This experience is like something that like, sometimes I would listen to a piece of music and in person at a concert or something, and I'll be like, I hate it. I can't believe it. I can't believe it ended like that. I can't believe it did this. And then I would walk away like 2 weeks later. I was like, oh my God, that was the best thing that I,
or if nothing else, they're still thinking about it.
Yes. Yeah. And you're like, oh,
because the loop is not closed. There's something that's left there for you.
Yeah. Something that lingers there because of form. But I think the biggest crushing work was like thematically trying to thread the occupants into the ending, right? From that was really tough, and that was the time when we like walked over to UBC or something just to kind of clear our heads and think about how to do that. So that was really challenging.
Yeah, I'm definitely like, as you are talking about it, I am thinking, like going back and thinking about it again. So something you just said, like you walk away from it and you're still thinking about it later. I think that's proof you've made something pretty powerful. People are still thinking about it long after they played it. Thank you for being so creatively vulnerable and honest with me in this chat. Like, I just want to say again that like I'm a big fan of this game, and I really, talking to you over this last hour, hearing how you put everything together, I can like that really comes through in 1000xRESIST. So I don't know, what do I say? Like, good job. Thank you for making such an awesome game. As a fellow writer, I love when my peers make something like this. It's very cool and exciting for me. So thank you so much for chatting today. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you for having us on.
Yeah, this was lots of fun. Thank you so much. Great questions. Great conversation.
Yeah, we
Thank
don't
you.
usually get to, talk in this register.
Theater kids, like
Yeah.
kids in the positive affectation, not negative.
Yes,
Like,
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.